Good morning or good afternoon, everyone, wherever you have joining us from. Who is Dave has the microphone off. You stick it on now. Great. Some background noise at the moment. Probably as moderator, you for everybody in a moment. Dave, we're delighted to have Dave Berri from the Southern Utah University. Thank you for muting. It's nothing personal, I'm sure you'll understand. But thank you, Dave, for getting up very early over in Southern Utah to present for us a paper on the NBA draft. It tells me the title has changed. The title was Stereotypes and Hiring Decisions, Lessons from the NBA Draft. And I'm really looking forward to whatever the talk is. I'm being schooled up and educated on the NBA. So go ahead, Dave, all yours.
All right. Well, thanks to everyone for having me. This is fun. It is amazing how technology works, that we can all sort of get together from all over the world, and yes, it is somewhat early in the morning. So I'm going to tell you some stories about the draft. I think first, because there's so many people here who are may not be completely familiar with North American sports, and also even people who are familiar may not even know some of these stories. So I'm going to start off. Let me sort of start off with what I think I'm going to title this paper as. This is the original title. Okay, and I'm thinking of this, so calling it "Failing to Let Go," and I'll explain why I like that title as we go along here. So these are all my co-authors. This paper started. I think Steve Walters and Jennifer Van Gilder and I presented this at the Western Economic Association meetings about 10 years ago. Steve Walters has been sending me emails probably about every 6 months since then, asking me when this would be finished. And so we presented it at the Westerns in March. And then after that, James asked me to present here, which I accepted as an incentive to get closer to being finished. And if Steve is joining us this morning, it's really close. I'm really close to being done. It's so close to being finished. So this is like a never-ending paper. All right, let me just start off with, this is probably not going to be in the paper. Maybe it will be. I don't know. But this is I want to give some background on where the idea of a draft came from, because this is such a weird and odd institution in labor markets. And the story is about a guy named Stan Koska. And he was a star with the Minnesota Golden Gophers in 1934 on their football team. The Minnesota Golden Gophers in 34, they had a reputation. The story is that they were such a dominant football team with Stan Koska that the Minnesota Golden Gophers would, in the first half of games, they would punt on third down. And that was sort of the deal they made with their opponent, that in the first half, they wouldn't go to fourth down. They would punt on third down if they didn't get the first down, just so that the game would stay close enough so that the second half would be interesting, because the Golden Gophers knew they were going to win anyways, because they had Stan Koska and the other teams didn't have Stan Koska. After the 34 season, some people raised some issues about Koska's eligibility. They claimed he played a season at Oregon. They declared that he was actually ineligible to play in 35. And so he decided to become a professional athlete. A bidding war ensues between two NFL teams, and one of them is the Brooklyn Dodgers. The other is the Philadelphia Eagles. Eventually, Koska signs with the Dodgers for $5,000 with a $500 bonus. At the time, that was the highest paid player in the NFL. Bronco Nagurski was the star of the NFL at that time. He was paid $5,000 as well. This is the end. Now, the NFL is quite a bit different at this point. The NFL today is the largest sports league in the world in terms of revenue. It's worth about $15 billion. In 1935, at that point, there had been something around more than 40 different franchises started in the NFL. About 90% of them had failed. Most NFL teams went out of business. This was a very struggling league. And so for them to get into this bidding war for this player was a financial problem. Bert Bell, the owner of the Eagles, the team that lost the bidding war, decided to respond to this by proposing a brand new system to fix these kind of bidding wars. Before we get to that system, I just want to note kind of what happened with Stan Koska. This is sort of as I was putting together this lecture this morning, I was thinking about this story. I told the Stan Koska story in my second book, Stumbling on Winds. And what I was interested in, though, and I was putting this together, is I knew that Stan Koska, when he got to the NFL, only played 1 year. He did not have a long career. He played 1 year. And one of the things I did not talk about in my first book was why did he only play 1 year? I did not actually look that up. So I was curious. And so I did what every great researcher does when they want to know something. I went to Wikipedia. And so I go to Wikipedia to find out, what's the story on Stan Koska? Why is he going to play 1 year? And I read through the story at Wikipedia, and it doesn't tell me anything that I didn't already know. And then I get to the end of the Wikipedia page, and it says, source of Wikipedia page information, Stumbling on Winds. I went, wait, I'm the source. That's why I'm not hearing anything I didn't know. So I then Googled some more. I did find an article that did offer a story, and this is actually relevant to sort of how the story that we're going to be telling today about the draft. Apparently, Stan Koska only played 1 year, and this is the story that I read, because the Brooklyn Dodgers didn't have any more money after they signed Stan Koska for $5,000. Their offensive line, they hired for $150. That was all they had to pay all of the players on the offensive line was $150. Koska had no one blocking for him, essentially. And basically, it appears, the way the story read is he was knocked out of most games. Most games he got knocked out of. Because apparently the teams on the other side looked at Stan Koska getting paid $5,000 as some sort of superstar and decided that the real football game that they were going to play is let's beat up Stan Koska. So Stan Koska's career ended after 1 year because the other teams beat the crap out of him. And so that was the end of Stan Koska. So Bert Bell, though, was unhappy. So that's why this picture, by the way, this is a picture from, this is a playing card that was produced in 1936. Stan Koska didn't play in 1936, so this card is a little bit misleading because he didn't actually play that year. So Bert Bell, though, proposes this new system, and he invents what is called the draft. And the idea is that instead of teams bidding for talents like Stan Koska, he proposed that teams go through a process where they select the top talent out of college each year. And what Bert Bell wanted is the teams that were the worst teams, he wanted them to pick first. Which was a very self-serving rule because the Philadelphia Eagles were the worst team. So Bert Bell wanted a system where he would pick first and that nobody could negotiate with the players that he picked. That's what the NFL draft is Bert Bell's idea to fix the problem of Stan Koska for him permanently. And so Bert Bell proposes this. Bert Bell goes on to become the NFL commissioner. But his institution gets established in 1936. The very first player drafted, the player the Eagles selected, was a player out of the University of Chicago. University of Chicago used to actually have a very good football team that they got rid of years ago. But they actually used to be known for their football team. And so the very first player drafted, Bert Bell offered him far less than $5,000 because he was the only one negotiating with him, and the guy decided to go to medical school instead. So that guy actually never played in the NFL. He's totally skipped his NFL career. He said, "I'm not going to play. You're not giving me enough money. I can go to med school. I don't need to play football." And so the question is, why does Bert Bell invent this institution? So there's obviously the monopsony story. The monopsony story is Bert Bell wants to create a system where he is the only one who gets to negotiate with the players he selects. And that is clearly what happens in the draft. Players who are drafted get paid less than what a free market would pay them, and so that's clearly what's going on. When we talk about the draft, and these things exist in the NFL and the NBA, Major League Baseball, the NHL, the WNBA, all different leagues now have these in North America. They often don't talk about the monopsony story. They don't say, we're doing this so that we can not pay these players. The reason why they say we do this is for competitive balance reasons. This is done so that teams that are the worst get to select from the best non-professional talent, and therefore they will become better and it will make the league more competitive. That's the story that they tell. And so there's this idea of the draft where what's going on here is bad teams have this opportunity to get better by picking the very best players. And for that to work, it must be the case that the bad teams actually know the identity of the very best players. And that is one of the things that people who have examined the draft in different sports have questions. Do you actually know who the best players are? So this is probably, I would guess, the most famous paper ever written about the draft. This is the paper by Massey and Thaler called The Loser's Curse. And it's famous because after they wrote the paper, probably about, I want to say the first draft of this is probably 15, 16, 17 years ago. It got released to the media, and then Massey and Thaler did a media tour, I think. I don't know. That's the things that people do with their papers now. And so this became a fairly famous paper that Richard Thaler and Massey argued that the NFL draft is quite inefficient in terms of the competitive balance purpose. Not inefficient in terms of restricting salaries, but in terms of competitive balance. So this graph captures the story they're telling. The red line that you see there is the trade value of draft picks. It's what people perceive when they're making trades, what they think these draft picks are worth. So the very first pick is worth the most by a lot. And if you want to acquire the first pick in the draft, you're going to have to give up a lot of assets to get that pick because it's considered incredibly valuable. And then these Massey and Thaler said, what we're going to look at is the difference between what they called the surplus value, the difference between the actual value of the players in terms of what they do on the field and what you're paying them. So it should be the case that the first pick is indeed the most valuable, then the surplus value should be the highest for that. You don't have to pay them very much, but they're incredibly valuable on the field. They produce a tremendous amount of value, and that's why you want that pick. Well, when they measured surplus value, what they found is that the most valuable pick wasn't the first pick in the first round. It was the first pick in the second round. When you look at the draft, it turns out, and the reason why we get this result is the players who are selected in the first round tend not to be tremendously different from each other. The teams don't really know which player is absolutely the best. And so often in the draft, the player who turns out to be the very best is not the first selection. So, and there's all sorts of examples of this. Probably the most famous example of this is Tom Brady, who some people consider the greatest NFL quarterback. I don't, but let's say he is. But he was selected in the 6th round out of Michigan. And part of the reason why that is Tom Brady wasn't a starter at Michigan. He actually lost his job to Drew Henson. And also, if you ever saw Tom Brady's performance at the NFL Combine, as I tell students when I show this video to them, Tom Brady is the least athletic male model ever in the history of male models. So if you ever saw him run, it doesn't look like he knows how to do that. But nevertheless, he's had a very stellar NFL career, but he was not picked with the first pick overall. All right. This is another paper written with the amazing Rob Simmons, whose picture is right there. So that's Rob. And so Rob and I did a paper looking at the draft, the NFL draft as well. And so we looked at quarterbacks. One of the issue with the Massey-Thaler paper is they tried to look at every single position. We really don't have measures of performance for every single position. So what they did is they looked at things like how many games they play, how many games they start, do they appear in the Pro Bowl, things that would be the same across all positions. The problem with using games started to evaluate whether your draft pick worked or not is you're using one evaluation, which is, should I start this player in a game, to evaluate another evaluation, should I pick this player first overall? And so you're using one evaluation to check whether you got the other evaluation right. And this question is, well, which evaluation are you measuring here? Are you sure you got the game started right? So what Rob and I did is we looked just at quarterbacks, and we went and looked at things that were objective. What do we know about these quarterbacks? And so we looked at things like quarterback height. Wonderlic score is how they perform on IQ tests. 40-yard dash time, whether they played in the Division I or not. And we found that taller, smarter, if Wonderlic is a measure of smartness, faster quarterbacks played in Division I, they're more likely to be picked higher in the draft than quarterbacks who don't have those attributes. We didn't find that their player performance in college mattered as much as those other non-performance measures. What was interesting, though, in our study is that when we looked at actual performance in the NFL, we found that the factors that got you drafted weren't really related to whether you played well in the NFL. So it's not the case that players who score very high on the Wonderlic score actually are good NFL quarterbacks. The Wonderlic test is a 50-question test that has nothing to do with football. And it's odd that you would give a test to see whether somebody can play football that doesn't mention football. Quarterbacks aren't really asked to be book smart. You're not taking a calculus test behind the line of scrimmage. You're just asked to figure out whether you can read the defense or not. And often when you see quarterbacks being interviewed on television, it's pretty apparent the only thing they do know how to do is read a defense. They don't really know how to answer questions. I know how to read a defense. That's the extent of my knowledge of the world. And so we found that it turns out that draft position and how well the quarterback plays on a per play basis are not actually related to each other. So that means NFL teams do a really, really bad job of selecting quarterbacks. They really don't know which quarterback they should be selecting. And that's not hard to understand because a quarterback's performance depends crucially on the players around them. So it may be that you selected a really good quarterback, but the players around them, as Stan Koska discovered back in 1935, that the players around you aren't any good, then you're not going to play very well. Okay. Turning now to the NBA, that's what we're going to be talking about mostly today, this is the very first paper I wrote with Stacy Brooke and Aju Fenn looking at predicting the NBA draft. And so we put together this model to look at what explains where players are selected in the NBA. Now, basketball is quite a bit different than football. On the surface, it looks similar because it looks like basketball and football, a performance of a basketball player depends a great deal on the players around them. That you would think that would be the case. When you look at the data, and there's a lot more data on basketball players than there are on football players. When you look at the data, points scored, shooting efficiency, rebound, steals, all of these different statistical measures, it turns out basketball players are the most consistent athletes in team sports. They're more consistent than baseball players. Basically, if you think about basketball players' careers, LeBron James has played on a variety of teams with a variety of coaches, supposedly in a variety of different basketball systems, and LeBron James, everywhere he goes, is exactly the same player. His shooting efficiency is essentially the same, his rebounds are the same, his assists are the same. Basically, LeBron is the same no matter what. And you think about that, you have to understand every time LeBron takes the court, the other team knows that LeBron is going to take a fair number of shots. He's going to handle the ball a lot in this game. They are geared to stop him, and he's now been playing. He's now in his late 30s, so he's been playing for almost 15, 16 years now, and nobody has figured out how to stop him because he's way better than everybody else. And so basketball players are remarkably consistent. So you would think, given how basketball is, that NBA teams ought to be really good at this drafting thing, because in basketball, you get to see the players play in college. You get to know what they're going to do. You should be able to pick who the best players are. What we found in this study back in 2011 is that the factors that drove performance, that drove draft position, were how many points the player scored, how old they were, they picked younger players first, and Final Four appearances. And the Final Four appearances was especially interesting at the time. What we found is that if you appeared in the Final Four the year you got drafted, you got picked several slots higher. However, if you go back to school, and then your team doesn't appear in the Final Four the next year, that Final Four magic that you had the previous year, it vanishes. It doesn't have any impact on whether you're drafted. So really what you're seeing there is the NBA draft position, NBA draft decision makers are focusing on a factor, Final Four appearances, has nothing to do with predicting NBA performance. And they're using that to evaluate who they should pick. So there's inefficiencies here with associating with the NBA draft. Okay. The other thing is the scoring thing. Okay, and we're going to talk about that in a second as well. Is why do they focus on the scoring factor so much? Before we get to that, I want to note this other paper I wrote with Tiffany Greer and Josh Price. This paper is looking at, we published this just a couple years ago. This paper is looking at exactly who's in the pool. So we're not looking at the order in which they're selected in this paper. We're just looking at whether or not you're in the draft pool or not. Which players are being considered for the draft and which players are not. And what we found, and I think the really key finding in this is it found very similar things to the earlier study. But what was really interesting is that the average winning percentage on of the teams the players played for in college was 72%. Basically, the NBA is almost exclusively focusing on players from winning teams. If you're not on a winning team, they typically won't consider selecting you. So they're eliminating half the sample when they start. And when you analyze player productivity, you learn one player cannot make a winning team by themselves, as Stan Koska learned. And so that was an interesting result as well. Okay, let me explain just the whole thing about the scoring thing. So this I write this in a lot of things that I put out, a lot of articles I write for the popular press, and this has appeared in some of my books. It's just this idea that basketball is a fairly simple game to understand. And so basically teams win because A, you acquire possession of the ball without the other team scoring. So you grab defensive rebounds, you create turnovers. If you do those things, the other team won't score, you have the ball. You keep possession of the ball. Don't give the ball back to the team. So don't commit a turnover, grab offensive rebounds if you miss. And then finally, you turn your possessions into points, which means you shoot efficiently from the field and the line. That's it. That's the game of basketball. That's all there is to it. Basketball players are primarily about rebounding, turnovers, shooting efficiently. If you do those things, your team wins. If you don't do those things, you lose. When evaluating players, that's what you should focus on. Years ago, Dean Oliver, it might have been Dean Oliver or somebody else, listed these as the four factors. The four factors in basketball, which are shooting efficiency from the field, shooting efficiency from the line, rebounds, turnovers. Those are the four factors. That's what you use to evaluate players. What's interesting about decision-making in the NBA is that the four factors, even though those determine wins, are not driving decision-making. What they're focusing on primarily is how many points you score. How many points you score is a function of how many shots you take. And the word in thinking about shot taking is the word take. You take shots from your teammates. If you are not there, your teammates will take the shots that you were going to take. So when a player like Carmelo Anthony left the Denver Nuggets, left the Denver Nuggets years ago, and got traded to the New York Knicks, the number of shots that the Nuggets took after Carmelo Anthony left was almost exactly the same. The same thing is true when Allen Iverson left the Sixers. The same thing is true when Donovan Mitchell doesn't play for the Utah Jazz. The shots taken end up being essentially the same. They don't create shots. They just take shots. And what's also interesting is when Carmelo Anthony left the Nuggets, the shooting efficiency of the team actually got better. When Donovan Mitchell was missing this year at the end of the season, the Jazz in the last 10, 15 games when Mitchell wasn't there actually shot better without him. So shooting efficiency is not so much a function of those players taking lots and lots of those players who take lots and lots of shots. Okay. The thing about you can use all those things to measure performance in basketball, and this is the other thing I want to point out is that when it comes to measuring performance, we can measure how many wins a player creates with those statistics. I've done this for the WNBA, NCAA men's basketball, NCAA women's basketball, the NBA. Basketball is essentially basketball. No matter what basketball you look at, you get essentially the same results. The relative value of the statistics is the same in all of those different venues. I illustrated this in an article I just finished writing. I estimated a model with data from the ABA, which is late 60s, early 70s, and some NBA data from the 1970s as well. So data from the 60s and 70s. And then I used it to measure performance in the NBA this last year in 2019-20, not this last, the year before. And you could measure it almost exactly the same as if you use data from 2019-20. The model is exactly the same. There's really no difference. You can take a model from 50 years ago and explain this year's performance just as well. Basketball is basketball. Measuring performance is not that difficult, which again suggests they should be able to figure out who the best players are. This should not be that difficult. All right, so this is what we know. Productivity in basketball can be measured accurately, and decision makers don't seem to know this. So what we want to do next, what this paper is doing, is considering some other factors that decision makers could consider that we did not consider in the earlier research. And that brings us to the story of Andrew Wiggins. Okay, so Andrew Wiggins was considered the very top player to be drafted in 2014. The draft was labeled the Wiggins draft. Wiggins was supposed to be the best prospect since LeBron James. And so one general manager admitted anonymously that they were going to tank the 2013-14 season. They were going to lose as many games as possible in the hope that they could land Andrew Wiggins and transform their franchise. So Wiggins is supposed to be a phenomenal player. He played 1 year at Kansas because the NBA has a rule that says that you have to go to college for 1 year. And so he played 1 year at college. At Kansas, the team went 25-10. They weren't phenomenal. They were good, but not great. They lost in the second round of the tournament to a team that was defeated in the next round by Dayton, which is not a great NBA power, college basketball power. Wiggins was an above average scorer in college, but relative to other players taken, he was not a phenomenally above average scorer. But in terms of the other statistics, the things that matter in terms of winning, he was below average in shooting efficiency, below average in rebounding. He wasn't prone to turnovers, which is good, but that's primarily because Wiggins never passed the ball to anybody. So he wasn't likely to commit to turnovers because he didn't like passing to people. So Wiggins is not a great player in college. Despite that, okay, he is still the number one choice in the 2014 draft. So we're going to add in some other factors that maybe teams are going to consider. So compared to that 2011 paper, we're going to add in instead of Final Four, we're going to add in also consideration of how much your team actually wins. We're going to consider the high school recruiting evaluation, and then we're going to consider this factor called colorism. And so I'll explain that in a second here. Let me explain the recruiting issue. So every year there's various different groups that evaluate high school prospects. And there's an index called the Recruiting Service Consensus Index. It's a collection of these different expert opinions, and you can Google this stuff. Basketball Reference reports this back to 1998. So they create this sort of overall index of these different measures, and the groups that comprise the index change from year to year because it's not always the same experts. But typically included is things like 247 Sports and ESPN and Rivals are typically part of this. And so they create this measure of who are the best high school prospects. And they do this every year. And so that's a factor that we're going to think about in terms of evaluating the draft. Okay. We're also going to consider the issue of race, but we're going to do it a little differently than a lot of articles do in economics. Typically in economics, when race is considered, a dummy variable is considered, which is usually set as 1 for black or 0 white, or 1 white, 0 black. Doesn't make a difference how you do the dummy variable. As a lot of social scientists argue, race is entirely a social construct. There is no biological meaning to race. Whether or not somebody really is black or white is often the perception of the person looking at them. And so I often ask my students this. Is Jason Kidd black? Is Blake Griffin black? And these are people who one of their parents is black, one is white, and so it's not really clear whether they're black or white. And so a different way of getting at race, and I've done this in other articles, is to measure skin tone. And there's a literature in the social sciences on colorism, the idea that there is discrimination against people with darker skin tones versus lighter skin tones. So there's a process by which you can follow where you can actually objectively measure a person's skin tones. This was done, and I noted this in my textbook. This is a picture of Derrick Rose. So you measure the color of Derrick Rose's skin at different points on his face, and then you create sort of an average of that, which we call the RGB score, the red, green, blue score. And players who are considered African Americans typically will have a score that is lower than 400. Players who are white will have a score that is higher than that. And so this is a way of sort of measuring, objectively getting at this issue of race by measuring the color of their skin. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. All right, so this is the model that I'm putting together for this paper. So the dependent variable is simply draft order. We're only looking at players who were selected from college, so non-NCAA players are not part of the data set because they don't have college stats. The independent variables are the box score statistics from college, adjusted for position played. This is something that you have to do if you're going to analyze basketball statistics. You got to adjust for position played. If you don't do that, you're probably not doing this quite right, because a center or a power forward getting 7 or 8 rebounds a game is not that impressive. A point guard getting 7 or 8 rebounds a game is really quite impressive. You have to consider what stats they're getting relative to what position they're playing, because every position in the NBA gets all of the stats. So if you look at any position in the NBA, every position, there are players. All the players will block shots, get steals, get rebounds, shoot efficiently, whatever. They do all of it. But how much they do depends on the position they play. Guards tend to be more turnover prone because they handle the ball more often. They're not going to rebound as well. They're not going to block as many shots. They're probably going to get a few more steals. Big men are going to get a lot of rebounds. They're going to block shots. They're not going to turn the ball over as much typically, but they're not going to get a lot of assists. They're not going to get a lot of steals. You have to evaluate a player relative to what is expected at that position. So there has to be some sort of position adjustment. And then we're going to consider team performance. Did they appear in the Final Four? What was the winning percentage? We'll consider position played. We'll consider height. We're going to talk a little bit about the combine factors. I'm going to talk about those a little bit here. And then we have this pre-college evaluation as well, this RCSI index. Okay. And then so these are the basic summary statistics of the variables that we're looking at. So again, we have the basic box score statistics. If you're going to do shooting efficiency, a measure you want to think about is effective field goal percentage. That takes into account 2-point shooting and 3-point shooting. These are the performance of the players in the draft pool. And so these are all players selected since 2000. So the average player effective field percentage is about 54%. These players tend to be efficient scorers. And so again, these are all adjusted for position play. So the mean in the sample is 7.9 rebounds. This is all per 40 minutes, by the way. So the stats are also done on a per minute basis or per 40 minute basis, not per game basis. And then we have dummy variable for being in the Final Four, and then team winning percentage. Again, most players selected are selected from winning teams. Okay. Okay. I don't know why I had that twice there. This is, I think I put that in there twice. Oh, let me point this out. This is the age. The average age is 21. These are the RCIs. I don't think there's any more here that I want to point out. This is basically the same thing I had before. All right. Okay. This is something what?
There's a question, a raised hand from Sebastian Otten. Are you happy taking a question?
I can take a question if it's a good question. No, go ahead. What's your question?
Hi, Dave. Just a quick question. You have shown like negative values for assists and blocks in your summary statistics. Can you just say how that is possible?
It's possible because a lot of these players play in different dimensions. And so this data set is very, very complete. So it's not just Earth data. That's a joke. No, it's because it's adjusted for position play. And so it's the method of doing that is it's the way I adjust for position played is you take the average, you take the player's performance, subtract off the average at that position, and then you add back in the overall average. If you're really, really below average for your position, then you'll end up with a negative value because you're so far below the average, it ends up being negative. Does that make sense?
Yeah, okay, I see. Thanks.
Okay, all right. Okay, so this is something when I was doing this paper 15, well, I don't know, 14, when we do with this Aju Fen, we were putting together this NBA draft paper originally. Aju Fen, I think had just gotten out of, I think he graduated from Iowa State maybe just a few years before we were doing this. So he was somewhat fresh out of graduate school. And typically when people are fresh out of graduate school, they get taught a lot of statistics and econometrics, and they feel like you have to do certain things. And so Aju was very insistent that we couldn't measure our draft model with simple OLS. We had to do something much more sophisticated than that. And I remember having this conversation with him where he was saying, you know, you absolutely have to make these adjustments. You have to measure it. You have to estimate the model. This way, you can't do it with OLS. And if we do that, if we don't do that, the referee is definitely going to note that. And I said, whatever, Aju, we'll do it however you want. I would note you could measure this with different estimation techniques. You don't get tremendously different results. But nevertheless, we did it the way Aju said. And I remember one of the referee reports we got on the paper we submitted, and one of the comments was, I've never heard of your estimation method. Can you explain what that exactly is? So Aju's position was, you must measure it, you must estimate it this way. The referee will definitely know this, and the referee didn't know what he was talking about. So, but nevertheless, this is how we measure it. So, so this is a remnant of Aju. So these are the results of the estimation, which, as I put the slides together, I realize you can't probably see those very well. And the only reason why I put these up, the slide together, even though you can't see it very well, is simply to point out that this is something that older faculty, older professors will appreciate. So when you're, so I got my PhD in '97, I guess. So I was in graduate school in the '90s. I'm old enough that when I was in school, Excel hadn't been invented yet. And so you had to learn, you know, us older people, we all had to learn how to use spreadsheets and stuff as we went along, because there weren't classes in these things, because the technology didn't exist. And so, and then as your career progresses, you learn different software techniques, software packages. So a lot of us are using Stata, although many people have migrated over to R yet. I've not done that. I'm still using Stata. But one thing I was teaching my senior seminar this year, and I had 28 students all doing senior research projects. So 28 different projects I was supervising. And I was going over one of these projects with a student. I was saying, you know, show me your model, show me how you're doing this. And they were estimating it in Stata, and they had this command that I had not seen, because of course I never took a class in Stata, because, you know, that didn't exist. And the command was, you can actually get results in Stata, and it'll just generate a table automatically for you to put in your paper. And that's the table, so what you're looking at is a table it generates. I'm like, that's so cool. I didn't know you could do that. So I actually just put that slide together so that I learned something. So I learned how to do that. Let me tell you what the results are saying. These are the results. These are the statistics, the independent variables that were statistically significant, and marginal effect is essentially the slope. One standard deviation is getting at the economic impact of the variables. So if you look at the factors that matter the most in terms of draft, we're finding something very similar to what we found in the original paper with Stacy and Aju. The thing that drives draft position is points. Negative value means you're drafted earlier, so negative would mean you're drafted higher. So a 1 standard deviation in points increases your draft position by about 4 draft slots. And you'll notice there's two ways we're doing this. One is with the combined factors. The other is not. So the combined factors that we are considering here, and so the NBA has a combine where they bring together all the players and they measure them. We're going to look at height without shoes, wingspan, and body fat. So we're going to note those things. And so with or without the combined factors, basically you see the same thing in terms of the statistics. Points is what dominates. Shooting efficiency matters, doesn't matter quite as much as scoring points. Scoring points is about twice as important. I will note that does suggest some learning has gone on, because in our original paper back in 2011, shooting efficiency did not matter. So NBA teams have figured out that shooting efficiency has some value. Still not as much value as just scoring points, but it does have some value. Rebounds matter, but quite a bit less. And so it's really scoring as a stat that matters. The colorism effect. This result says that players who are lighter in skin tone get drafted earlier because the higher value means you get drafted earlier. So that suggests that NBA decision makers discriminate against darker skin tones. That result, it's significant in both of these models, but when I write up the article, we're going to note it's not significant. It depends on how you specify the model. Almost every result I'm showing you here, no matter how you specify the model, that's the result you get. Colorism is not as consistent in that sense. It's not as robust. So there is some evidence that darker skin tones that there's some discrimination. I'm not sure it's perfectly robust. So that's something that we're going to write about. Team winning percentage also matters. And then the combine factors, height without shoes matters, wingspan matters, body fat percentage, higher your body fat percentage, the later you get drafted. Age, every year of age, every year you stay in school reduces your draft slots by 4 points, by 4 positions. So if you stay all 4 years, you're going to be drafted 18 slots later. 4.5 times 4, so 18 slots later. So staying in school, the NBA does not want you staying in school. This is the result, though, that I think, this is why I want to change title of the paper to failing to adjust here. This result right here, being a top 5 RCSI, that's what Andrew Wiggins was, improves your draft position 8 to 9 slots, holding everything else constant. There's nothing in this model that has a bigger effect than that. So basically, the decision makers look at these players and they say, hey, this guy was a top high school recruit. They then watch them play in college. They actually watch them do the job that they're hiring them to do. And they still end up concluding, I still want to take this guy, even though I've already seen him play. And so that is something that I think is really quite interesting, that they just don't adjust their evaluation very much. Okay. So wins in basketball are about shooting efficiency, rebounds, and turnovers. These are not the statistics that primarily drive evaluation. As we saw before, scoring and age, young scorers are picked first. We also see team performance matters. The Final Four result is still there. Winning percentage matters. Skin tone matters. Not as big as an impact. But this whole thing with the RCSI, though, I think is what is probably the most interesting result here. Okay, this is the other part of the story. How do these factors predict performance? And I did not quite update. This is the part that I did not quite finish for this presentation. This is exactly the same results I had back in March. And so this is not exactly the same model that I just showed you, but it's pretty close to the same thing. What are the factors, though, that drive NBA performance? So we can measure performance in the NBA. What are the factors that drive this? And what we see here is that the factors that drive NBA performance, scoring is significant but negative, and that means, and this is something that we also found in the earlier study, players who score a lot in college have a hard time adjusting to the NBA. When you get to the NBA, you're not going to be the primary scorer, and that's actually a negative. So you should not draft scorers first overall. That should not be. You should focus on shooting efficiency and rebounds, and not how many shots they were taking in college is not necessarily the thing that you should be concerned about. So the things that do matter, rebounds and shooting efficiency, definitely do predict performance, which is not surprising because of those things that drive performance. Again, those are not the factors that are driving, that are necessarily driving the drafting. Whether or not you're an RCSI top 5 player, that is not related to NBA performance. That should not make any difference at all. That is not predicting anything. Final Four appearances also don't drive anything either. We also looked at performance after the second year, and basically the same result. And so again, the RCSI does not really matter very much at all. Okay, so back to Andrew Wiggins. So Andrew Wiggins ends up being taken a lot earlier than he probably should have been, because he was considered the top high school recruit. What happened when he got to the NBA? He has now played in the NBA for 7 seasons. This is the data after 6 seasons. He has never been a very productive NBA player. He's been paid an awful lot of money. He's been paid about $100 million by now because he got paid over $20 million this last year. But he has never been he did not turn into LeBron James, exactly as his college performance suggested. He was not going to be a great player, and he was not. The Minnesota Timberwolves are the team that ended up with him in 2014. They traded him to the Golden State Warriors. He has not been phenomenal for the Warriors either. By the way, you can find all of this data, all of the wins produced data, if you're looking at doing basketball research. Rod Ford has graciously allowed me to put all of that data on his sports business page. So, and I will update it. I'll do that sometime this summer. I'll put the 2020-21, the last season, I'll put that up there as well. So I have wins produced data back to 1973. I will try to, hopefully Rod will let me do this. I will try and put up data also for college men's and women's basketball, as well as WNBA data, as well as ABA data. I'll try to get all of that there if I can, so that you guys can have access to all this stuff. This is what I think is interesting. Sort of, this is outside the sample because I want to look at how how this stuff predicts NBA performance. So we're not going to look at the last 2 drafts here in this study. But Anthony Edwards was the player taken by the Minnesota Timberwolves with the first pick last year. So the Minnesota Timberwolves trade away Andrew Wiggins, a guy who was a top high school recruit who did not turn out. They kept losing. They ended up with the #1 pick again in 2020, and they selected Anthony Edwards. Edwards was a top 5 high school recruit. He averaged 19 points a game at Georgia, but he only shot 47% from the floor. Again, that's below average. We said the average draft pick is about 54%. He's only at 47%. His wins produced per 40 minutes in college is .069. Average is .1, and so he's below average. He still was the #1 pick in the NBA draft. His wins produced per 48 minutes as a rookie in the NBA is negative .029. He's a negative player. He is exactly what you think he would be. He is not a very good NBA player. That was exactly predictable. And so the same decision makers who got burned on Andrew Wiggins just keep doing the same thing over and over again. And this leads to a result that I call the lottery treadmill. NBA teams end up going back to the lottery again. So the NBA draft is, they now, because they worry about teams tanking to get picks, they assign the top 3 picks by a lottery. The losing teams that don't make the playoffs, go in this lottery, and you end up with the same teams back in the lottery year after year after year. The Phoenix Suns just completed 10 consecutive seasons of being in the lottery before they acquired Chris Paul and got in the playoffs. The Minnesota Timberwolves are routinely in the lottery. Michael Jordan, who leads the Charlotte Hornets, has led them for many years, has been in the lottery most years. He's been the owner, which I always find that to be a pretty amusing story, because Michael Jordan as a player supposedly was exceedingly competitive, and yet he keeps losing. I find that to be amusing. All right. Last few notes on this, because I think we're running out of time, and I told too many stories. I want to note, Red Auerbach, who coached the Celtics back in the 1960s, seemed to know this, because he wrote this in his autobiography. He noted, individual honors are nice, but no Celtic has gone out of his way to achieve them. We've never had a league's top scorer. We won 7 league championships without placing one among the league's top 10 scorers. Our pride was never rooted in statistics, which means we don't focus on scoring. His leading player there in that picture is Bill Russell, known for rebounding, known for defense, known for blocking shots. Red Auerbach knew the best way to build a team was to not focus on scorers, but focus on all the other players. And he won lots of championships doing this. Greg Popovich did the same thing with the Spurs. But NBA decision makers don't seem to be learning the lesson of Red Auerbach. Just real quickly, I was going to spend more time on this morning, but I'm just going to go through this real quickly in case you guys have some questions. I had a student this last year in our senior research seminar apply the Massey-Thaler approach to the NBA, looking at surplus value. So he went through and measured the surplus value of each NBA draft pick. And I want to show you his basic results. So I'm going to show this to you. So this is just a table ranking where the top surplus value is He pointed out the first pick in the draft does have the highest surplus value, but he also pointed out that was driven entirely by one or two results. If you take out a couple of results, then that's not actually what you get. But you'll notice that if you rank them in order, it goes 1, 3, then pick 19, then pick 23, then pick 15, then pick 22, and then at the bottom, pick 4, pick 8, pick 2, pick 5. This is the graph of what it looks like. Surplus value looks like that. There's no real consistent pattern to it. So surplus value is not. This is looking at the soft. So surplus value is not something that has any real pattern to it. And I think that's sort of that's really the important story here, is that these people do not really know how to select players. And I think that's really the big picture. NBA teams have all this abundance of information. They get to see the worker perform the job. They have all these physical measures of the athletes. They have pre-assessments, and they still seem to be getting this wrong. And I think that leads us to ask the question, if NBA teams, if sports teams can't get the hiring decision right, exactly who else gets the hiring decision right? Because every other hiring decision in the labor market, we don't have all that information. Are we getting any of this right? So I think that's the last little bit there. So how do we? So James, how do I shut off the thing? Oh, there. Did I shut it off?
Somewhere. It's still there, but it's okay because you might want to refer to
there
it.
It is. There, I think I did it. Right
yeah,
there.
there you go. Great.
There,
well, thank you, Dave. That was very, very interesting. Understandable to a non-basketball fan here. So thank you very much for that. And there's loads of time for questions for Dave and comments. So if anyone has any, please do feel free to raise your hands.
Are they stunned into silence?
At the moment, it could just be. It could also be my. I tend to find that sometimes I don't.
Dennis is raising his hands.
Dennis, yeah.
Hey Dave, interesting as always. Kind of entertaining too. My question is, you see these teams that are routinely at the bottom. So you talked about the Timberwolves and the Bobcats. I wonder if there is something, if you were to track executives through time, because they don't always stay in the same place, and that, there's a lot of recycling of executives, that the head coach place A becomes the head coach at place B and so on. And I wonder if you could follow this ineffectual decision making from place to place with individual coaches, or individual coaches in managing trees, or, follow the root and branch, that if there would be something to that. So just give me your thoughts on that.
Can I comment on your hair? Because I'm digging the hair. I like the hair. I
Yeah,
think the hair's
great.
cool. I think the hair's cool. I like this. I like the long hair look. I like this. I like that. That's
again.
That to me is the story of the morning. Is Dennis has great hair now. I like that. I think that's the pandemic has done you well. All right. I think you could do that. I think this is a thought that I have about decision making in the NBA. The San Antonio Spurs are such an interesting case study. So for those of you who are not NBA fans, the San Antonio Spurs with Greg Popovich took over the Spurs in the mid 90s. They drafted Tim Duncan. They got the first pick overall, and Tim Duncan was with them for a long time. But then after Tim Duncan, the Spurs, because they were somewhat successful, they also had David Robinson. The reason why they got Tim Duncan is because David Robinson was hurt for an entire year. So they actually went from having no real talent to having Tim Duncan and David Robinson at the same time. So they went from being a really bad team to being a really great team all at once. And that meant that they were going to be drafting much later in the draft. And so Greg Popovich was getting these late first-round draft picks and second-round draft picks. And the Spurs are also in a very tiny market, and their owner is somewhat frugal and wasn't willing to spend money on players. And so Tim Duncan got surrounded by a lot of players who were passed over by other teams. Tony Parker and Manu Ginobili are two examples of this. Even Kawhi Leonard, though, was picked 15th overall. He was not a lottery pick. And so the Spurs put together this roster of players who were drafted much later. And they were successful. They had 20 consecutive years where they won more than 50 games, 20 consecutive years where they were a top playoff team. And it was not all Tim Duncan. Tim Duncan cannot win 50 games by himself. At most, Tim Duncan was producing about 20 wins by himself. So they had to get a lot of contribution from a lot of other players. And they were doing it all with these second-round draft picks, late first-round draft picks. And then, and this sort of gets at Dennis's question, the NBA got a giant television contract in 2016, and then suddenly every NBA team had cash, even the San Antonio Spurs. And the Spurs went out with Tim Duncan getting older and getting close to retiring. They went out and they got LaMarcus Aldridge, who was an all-star power forward, but not a good power forward. He was an all-star in the Carmelo Anthony sense. He did not shoot efficiently. LaMarcus Aldridge shoots about 48% from the floor. And the story is that when LaMarcus Aldridge gets to San Antonio, Greg Popovich tried to coach him like he coached those second-round draft picks and tell LaMarcus Aldridge, I don't want you taking every shot that you feel like taking. I want you to take shots from places where you're going to be good at taking the shots. I want you to play basketball the way we play basketball. And the story that I read is that LaMarcus Aldridge finally told Greg Popovich, leave me alone. Let me play the way I want to play. I shoot because I feel like it. I'm going to shoot. I'm going to score 25 points a game, and you're going to leave me alone. And Greg Popovich was sort of, I think in his mind, got stuck with, well, either I run this team the way I want to run it, and I'll never get a free agent to come here as a superstar, and that's going to hurt me, or I just give in. And he did. He gave in. He gave in LaMarcus Aldridge. He gave in DeMar DeRozan, who's another star that they acquired. And the Spurs, since they've acquired the stars, are now bad. They're not good anymore. And I think this is sort of getting at this whole, about executive decision making, is I think the Spurs figured out something. That if you take players later in the draft, players who can't go get another job very easily, they're going to be coachable, and you can tell them what to do. And Greg Popovich did that with a lot of success for 20 years. But if you take lottery picks, you're going to have a hard time coaching them. These guys know that scoring gets you paid. Scoring gets you maximum contracts. Anthony Edwards, despite being a very bad basketball player, is going to get a maximum contract because he scores a lot of points, and he knows this. How are you? You cannot go to Anthony Edwards right now at 19 years old and tell him, you'd be a lot better if you weren't shooting 47% if you learned how to take a damn shot. You're not going to do that. Anthony Edwards knows what's going to get him paid. There's a great quote from Stephen Marbury, who was star point guard of the New York Knicks, and the Knicks were awful, and Marbury was their star point guard. And some reporter asked Stephen Marbury, who was a point guard, he was supposed to pass the ball to his teammates, but he didn't. He shot a lot. Why do you play like this, Stephen? Why do you do this? And his answer was extremely honest. He said, I'm a maximum salary player. I'm a max player. So the NBA has a max salary on veteran players. They can only get paid so much. He says, I'm a max player. I'm a max player because of the way I play. Playing the way I do got me a max contract, and that's why I play that way. I'm like, that is so damn honest, because it's totally true. That's exactly why he does it. The Knicks didn't win, but Marbury got paid. And so that's why they do that. So I think you can do what Dennis did, but I think one of the issues is as conditions change, executive decisions are going to change too, because Popovich, I think he stumbled on the right model. He stumbled on the Red Auerbach model. Don't get star players, get role players. Bill Russell today would be a role player. Bill Russell couldn't shoot worth crap. He also didn't shoot. He rebounded and he played defense, and they won championships with that. Bill Russell today would be DeAndre Jordan. That's who he beat. And nobody thinks DeAndre Jordan's a star. He wins a lot, but he's not a star. All right, next question. John has a question. John has a question.
Hi, Dave. Excuse my lack of knowledge in this area. Just a quick one. With your results, you showed that colour has no impact there as an insignificant coefficient, and you've got a big effect on points. I was wondering whether or not you thought maybe splitting the sample and seeing whether points matter dependent on, say, skin tone. Because obviously, if you just look at a simple kind of white players versus black players, you might get about a 25-75% split, and whether is the case that you score more points as a coloured or a black player, you get actually a higher pick up the draft pick. But if it's, say, just a white player, it's much more of a narrower impact. I don't know if that's been done ever in the past or whether it's worth doing.
No one's ever done that I know of. So that's interesting. We could do that. We could look at that, whether or not that makes a difference. Yeah, I'm gonna have to work on the colorism result. When it comes to we do a lot of race studies in sports. There are certainly, it's very clear in certain areas there is race discrimination. Quarterbacks in the NFL tend to be white. There was a pretty good study, I think, that was done that showed that black quarterbacks get fired earlier. I think that's pretty clear if you just look at the anecdotal data that's true. And I think in terms of coaching, I think black coaches get treated differently than white coaches. And so you can see that 80% of coaches are white. But when it comes to player evaluation, I wrote a paper with Aju Fen and Jennifer Van Gilder looking at this, and we put together a model looking at voting in the MVP award, and we found, hey, race clearly matters. We specified the model the way it typically is done, and race definitely mattered. And then I said at the end of the article, but if you specify the model this way, which is perfectly valid, the race thing goes away. And it's like, it depends on how you put the model together. So maybe we could try that. We could try something like that. But it is the case that race variable, when it comes to player evaluation, I think it's really kind of elusive. And I think my sense is that there probably is some racial bias in decision making. I don't know how systematic it is. I don't know that everyone has this. I don't know. It's just really kind of hard to get at.
Thanks, Dave.
Thanks, Johan. Ian Gregory-Smith has a question.
Hi, just continuing that thought. So you mentioned in the NFL there's very clear segregation into positions by skin tone. So I was wondering if you were thinking the same or trying the same with the NBA data. So do white and black players play different positions on the court? And whether, so I know you adjusted your performance statistics for position. So can you adjust in the same way, take the average of the colorism variable and do the same thing with that?
Well, there was a really interesting study, and I should know who did this. It's in my textbook, where they showed that you can find racial bias in the NBA until you put in height as a variable, and then when you put the height thing in, then it went away. That what ends up happening is in basketball, you have to have 7-footers, and so I don't think it's 80% of NBA players are black, but it's not 80% of 7-footers are black. Right. There's a lot more white 7-footers because you have to have 7-footers. And this is one of the things about the NBA that makes it so that the NBA is not a competitive league. It never has been a competitive league, and it can't be a competitive league. The population it draws upon is incredibly tiny. And so 7-footers who are athletic get guarded by 7-footers who are, I think somebody once said that if you're a 7-foot tall male, you have like a 50% chance of playing in the NBA because they just have to hire you. It's like, we have to have you. So we don't care whether you can, there was George Murison played. He was actually, George Murison was hired to play Andre the Giant in a movie. He's 7 foot. He was 7'7", and the scouting report on George Murison, they said, well, he's 7'7". They said he's slow. And we don't mean that he's slow in that he's slow for an NBA basketball player. We mean he's slow, as in your Uncle Louie, who's 65 years old, is really slow. That's George Mercer. It's like he's not going to be able to move very fast. So don't expect him to play on both sides of the court. He's not going to make it. So I think there is something to that. I think there is something to looking at. And we do have height in this model, and so the colorism result was still there when the height was thrown in there, and so but there are other formulations of the model I put together where it did go away.
Do you have the same sort of stereotype in the NBA as in the NFL? So in the NFL, like the quarterback's the decision maker. So you have.
No, I don't know that point guards are deaf. I don't think there's a lot of. I don't think there's a lot of that in the NBA.
Okay.
I don't think so. There's a lot of very famous black point guards. I don't think that's the case at all.
Okay.
It is definitely the case of quarterbacks. You look at NFL quarterbacks, and it does seem like there are black quarterbacks. It seems like whenever they have a bad season, they get fired pretty quickly. And white quarterbacks just keep hanging on forever. I mean, Josh McCown, I think, has tried to retire twice, and they just keep back. It's like the guy's in his 40s, and people bring him back as a backup. They're like, Josh leaves the game, and they call him, Josh, will you please come back? And the way they talk about him is, well, they're really great in meetings. You're like, oh, okay. Is that code that they're white? Because they don't describe black quarterbacks that way. Hey, he's great in the meeting. Yeah. But white quarterbacks are described that way. He's so great in the meetings. We love him in the meetings. He holds the clipboard better than anybody else has ever held a clipboard. He's got clipboard skills. So yeah, you sort of see that. So I do think there is that kind of segregation. I think definitely happens.
Great, thanks.
Thanks, Ian. Any more questions, comments? Oh, two at once. But given Dennis has already asked, well, actually, both Sebastian and Dennis have asked questions. So who wants to go first? Dennis is off mute. Go on, Dennis.
Okay. So I'm a little bit interested in this colorism idea. And, you have this dichotomy, getting paid or winning championships. And I wonder if the colorism may be a little bit of way of getting at an impoverished background, relatively speaking, that a player from a poor background is going to buy into the getting paid more than a player with a middle class or better off background and be more interested in the winning championships aspect of it. So I don't know how much I would want to push on that, but I'd be curious if you interact colorism with shooting percentage, what that tells you, and particularly if you could then link it to pay. And
okay, all right, that's there actually was a tweet this morning from I don't know if you guys know who Andrew Gelman is, the stats guy at Columbia. This is when you said interaction effect, Dennis, I immediately thought of this tweet I saw like an hour ago. Andrew Gelman put out a tweet saying, if you have an interaction effect in your model, your sample has to be 16 times higher for it actually to matter. I don't know if that's true or not. I'm not a stats guy, but that's what he said. He said interaction effects. This is a question I would have for the Europeans, because I don't know this. A lot of the white players in Europe, in the NBA now, are white, are from Europe. Does anyone know of those Europeans who play basketball? Are they from impoverished background? Because my sense is that they're from Eastern Europe. So I don't get the sense that they're from exactly wealthy backgrounds. But I could be wrong about that. So I don't know. There are some white middle class players. There are also some black middle class players as well. I think you'd have to figure out which ones are which. And that would be a harder thing to get at, because figuring out which ones actually are from the middle class background. Grant Hill was a very successful NBA player from a very wealthy background. His father was Calvin Hill, who was a running back with the Cowboys, and his mother was I believe a Washington D.C. lawyer. And so he came from a phenomenally wealthy background, became a great NBA player. So you have to actually figure out which ones are from what background they're from. So it is the case. I mean, the incentive to get paid would be pretty big for all of them. It is the case the scorers get paid tremendous amounts of money, and it is not the case that they necessarily have to be tremendously efficient at shooting to do this. And that's really the problem in the NBA. Sebastian.
Yes, thanks. I really liked the presentation. It was really cool, Dave. I have a question about your model, and I might have missed it, but can you just briefly say how the RSCI measure is created? So how do they come up with that measure?
Okay, so they have every year there's a collection of scouting services, and it's not the same every year. It's whatever ones the RCI-SI people picked on, but they take the top 100 of each one, and they simply do an average. It's just an average of whatever's in the sample. So if your rating is 1, 4, 1, 3, they just average those numbers, and that's all there is to it. It's not very complicated.
But like in this measure, is there, so when they create the measure, is ability going into that measure? So how they do in high school in points and rebounds, is that part of that measure?
Well, it's whatever the scouts were looking at. One would suspect, given the way basketball decision makers look at it, they're focusing on scoring as well.
So what I was thinking about is how high is this RSCI measure correlated? So that is based on high school, right? Yeah. Correlated with what they do in college with points and stuff. And then I would like to see results without the RSCI measure, because what I have in mind is if we think about a standard wage regression, right? We have wage as an outcome variable, and we put in IQ. Let's assume we have a measure for IQ. Then we have ability already in our model. When we then put in the model the grades of your mass class or whatever, then what we are measuring is the effect of mass grades conditional on being a high or low IQ person. So what I'm saying is what your results are doing is conditional on being in these SCI score, and you put it in groups, right? 1 to 5, 6 to 9. Conditional on being in that group, how much is the effect of points and rebounds giving us on the ranking? So it is a conditional effect on being, and we are already measuring ability, right? So I would like to see results without these RSCI measure, and I would like to know how high is that correlated to all the other independent variables you put in your model, right? So that what is the real effect of what you showed, the coefficients of rebounds and stuff, that I would like to know. Have you done these results? Have you something in your mind?
Yeah, because the earlier paper from 2011 already did that. That's what we did. We didn't have the RCSI at that time, so we already published that. So okay. And they're the same. The results are essentially the same. There's no real difference. So the 2011. So the results we did. So that what's unique about this paper that we're working on now is that we're putting in the RSCI ones. So but the earlier paper.
The coefficients of rebound and points are not smaller, because how could it be?
I don't think. I mean, I could go look up the paper, but I don't think they look any different.
Because something has to be happened. Either your R squared is increasing, or the coefficients or something like that. Something has to be happened, right? Because
if those things are correlated, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
If they're correlated, but I don't know that they're correlated.
Okay, I see. But the RCSI scale was relevant in your model, right? I don't have the results.
Very relevant. Very relevant. Yeah.
Okay, good.
I mean, one of the things that you're picking up also is so there are these players who are the way I think about it is that these players are ranked really high in these high school rankings. They get to college, and the way I interpret this is they're not looking at the college performance as much as they should be. That it doesn't make as much difference if they play well in college or not. The decision maker still looks at those players and says, you know what, I still think they're great, even though they didn't play well. A good example of this is Andre Drummond, who was a top high school recruit, goes to Connecticut. Drummond apparently had an issue with, I don't think he wanted to go to college at all. And so his college performance was so awful that Charles Barkley on draft night, when the Pistons selected Andre Drummond, his evaluation was this: I don't mind the Drummond pick, but normally when I think you pick a guy in the NBA draft, you should pick somebody who knows how to play basketball. And I watched Drummond play at Connecticut, and I don't think he knows. And I think what was going on is that Drummond didn't want to play basketball at Connecticut, so he would just go through the motions in the game and not even try at all. And the Pistons were like, yeah, I don't care. We still think he's great. And they still picked him anyways, even though he didn't have any real stats or like that. Because he was an awful college player. He turned out to be a great NBA player. And so I think that's how I look at it. But we did do the model without the RC, and it does end up being essentially the same thing.
Okay. Yeah, I think it's mainly how you interpret the results, right? You have said already a kind of measure of ability included. So what are the coefficients on rebound and points really telling us, I think. But yeah, I believe the story. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Bastian. Any more questions and comments? Question I have as an ignorant non-American is, we're in this era of Moneyball where stats are being used to influence decisions. How is it that you're pointing out this this inefficiency in the market and it still persists over the years?
Oh, I could tell you that story. That's a fun story. All right, so for those who are not familiar with the NBA analytics community, we published this in a book, The Wages of Wins, back in 2006. The Wages of Wins was written up. Malcolm Gladwell wrote about it in the New Yorker. The New York Times wrote about our book. It was known. People heard about this. But at the time when we wrote this, the NBA analyst community had already started a few years earlier. And they reacted with a great deal of anger. They were very pissed off at this book. And basically what we were saying in the book is that NBA basketball is simple. Anyone can figure out who the best players are. You just have to shooting efficiency, rebounds, turnovers. It's the 4 factors. You already know this. Well, the NBA analyst community has gone in a totally different direction. They have created what are called plus-minus measures, where they look at how teams do with and without players on the court. And if anyone who studied stats would be able to look at these models and go, you have a massive amount of multicollinearity in your models. Your results are not very believable. Often what you're finding are correlations, but you're not finding you're not finding causality, you're finding correlations. And so these analytics, what they do is they do these plus minus models. That's what they're selling to NBA teams. And they're often telling, and then the models are not reporting initially what the NBA decision makers want to hear. So what they do is they play with the models until they produce the results that they would like to hear. So they go, you know what, Carmelo Anthony's phenomenal. Because the decision maker wants to hear that, and that's what they're going to pay to hear. And so I come along and go, Carmelo Anthony's not a very good player. Donovan Mitchell's not a very good player. No, you're wrong. We have these advanced analytics that say otherwise. And that's so. I do some work with a WNBA team that has a team that is affiliated with an NBA team, and they tell me the NBA team they work with, they go, well, they have analytics people. I said, they don't seem very successful. Well, they listen. One of my friends showed me this video of an NBA team. They were talking to their analytics people about the draft, and the analytics people said, you should draft this guy. He's great. And the decision makers in the video were like, that's exactly what we were thinking. You are so good. You analytics people are amazing. The guy they drafted lasted half a season. They were totally all wrong. So there's a problem with the analytics people in that the decision maker, the one who's making the ultimate choice, has no training in statistics, no training in any of this stuff. They don't know what they're buying. And they're buying analytics people who worked for other analytics people. And so there's just this community just sort of exists. And if the analytics community was forced to publish their results in a peer-reviewed setting to a group like this, people here would be like, wow, that's totally wrong. You can't say that at all. That model doesn't mean anything. You have this massive multicollinearity problem. And they also do stuff like this. This is you guys are going to love this. Their model, if one of the models they do is they regress the plus minus results. So you can look at a game and you can break it down into these samples where you look at the 10 players on the court as a sample, and then if a player gets substituted in, that's a new observation. So you look at the score with every group of 10 that's on the court, and you build this throughout the game. And then they run a regression. Score for each group as a function of the 10 dummy variables for the players that are there, and then zeros for everybody else in the NBA. That's the whole model. That's it. That's the model. That model explains 1% of outcomes because all you have are dummy variables. You have no stats. And then they do this. There was somebody who did this. The model doesn't explain anything. So they take the error term from the model and they add it back in to the evaluation of the players. Now we explain 100%. You can't add error terms back in. Sure you can. Why not? Because it's wrong. I think you're committing fraud. But they do stuff like that. They add error terms back in and stuff like that. You're like, oh, that's totally wrong. You're not supposed to do that. So that's the stuff they sell.
This is a highly competitive industry. I mean, why hasn't someone come along and given you a big fat check to advise?
Because in order to do that, you'd have to have the decision maker know that they're wrong. And every year somebody wins doing something. That's the thing about sports that is different. If everyone in the car industry did it wrong, the entire car industry would go out of business, right? But if everyone in the NBA does it, I wrote about that in our first book. The way I put it is, imagine every NBA team decides they have to play their mascot. We got to play the mascot. Well, somebody would win a championship playing a mascot, and then you'd have an argument about which is the best mascot. If you're all doing it wrong, you're not going to see that because somebody's going to win doing it wrong. And that's what ends up happening.
Okay, Johan's got another question.
Yeah, just a bit of a comment in terms of what you just mentioned there, James. It's almost like looking at football scouting. So I know a couple of scouts who actually work in the game, and it's almost like it's like a political capture kind of thing. If you tell a scout that he's wrong, you pick the wrong player, the scouts get really upset. If they compare analytics to their decision, it's like, but you're not looking at the personality. You can't measure the personality. You can't measure this, this, and this. And I think that's probably where you get quite a few of these inefficiencies. It's kind of saying that, yeah, he's got 4 goals in 90 minutes, per 90 minutes. It's a ridiculously good stat. But he crumbles under pressure. We don't want that kind of player. And I've inferred that by watching him. So it's almost as if you've got these kind of two kind of loggerheads at each other, both trying to get their kind of church across the other one. And it's almost like rather than working in tandem, they're working against each other, which is probably why you might be finding these kind of holes.
There's another example of this. You'll like this, James. This is similar to what John is saying. So I'm working right now with some people at Penn. We're working with, we're doing more NFL draft research. And the guy I'm working with, he actually was a quarterback in college who actually went through the whole combine thing and actually had a tryout with an NFL team. And he tells this story. He said a scout told him, the most important thing in measuring a quarterback's performance is hand size. Hand size is what matters. You got to measure their hands. Hands is everything. And he said, I went through the whole combine factor and they're all measuring my hand. They're just measuring my hand over and over again. Tell me about your hands. Your hands are great. So he then goes off to graduate school. He's now doing statistical analysis. And he says, hand size has 0 correlation with NFL. None. I can find no measure that is related to hand size. This is totally ridiculous. He says, but you can't tell the scouts that because they're like, no, it's all hand size. You got to have the right hands. And so that's what happens. You sit there and you say, well, that's totally irrelevant. But they've lived their lives knowing this. And this is a real problem with the decision makers is these jobs are so exclusive that to get one of these jobs, these people all believe they absolutely know what they're doing. I am sure Michael Jordan, after 15 years of failing with the Charlotte Hornets, is still convinced I know who the best players are. Dude, you've been doing this for 15 years. I think the only thing you know is that when Michael Jordan plays, you win, and you don't have Michael Jordan. Other than that, you know nothing. You're totally guessing. You're throwing darts at a wall here, and you can't tell them that. They believe they know, and they know all the people at the top teams, and those people at top teams tell them, well, we're doing the same thing you're doing. I mean, we're looking at the same stuff you're looking at, and they just don't know, and you can't go in. I once did work with an NBA team briefly. I did some draft analysis for them, and they asked me on this one player, you ranked them really low. Why are they so low on your ranking? Because our scouts think he's great. I said he can't shoot. His shooting efficiency is really, really low. And this is what this guy says to me on the phone. He goes, "Oh, shooting efficiency. I'll mention that to the scouts." I'm like, what do you mean? You just heard about that? I just introduced the concept of shooting efficiency. You never heard of that before? Ball's got to go in the basket. Never came up. What are you guys looking at? So they don't do that. They don't do stuff like that. They rely a lot on visual observation. And when you think about visually observing a player, scoring is what's going to stand out in your mind. You're gonna focus on the scores, and that's what they do. And you want to say, you guys really need to stop doing that. You need to focus on what's measurable. And they can't do it. They can't stop themselves. Carmelo Anthony has been in the league for a very long time. He's never been successful. He takes a lot of shots. There are still people who are absolutely convinced Carmelo Anthony is the greatest basketball player ever. You're like, no, he just shoots. He doesn't do anything else well. I'm telling you, have you seen the problem is you're not watching. If you watch, you can tell. You can tell what? That he doesn't shoot well? You can't. I've had these discussions many times, and what I tell my students when I go over this in class, because my students will do this, so I'll go through this in class with them, and I'll point out these issues. And I live in Utah, so Donovan Mitchell is the greatest thing ever, and he's not. He's another Carmelo Anthony. And my students go, "Oh, I argued with somebody last night about Donovan Mitchell," and I tell them, "Don't do that. You got to let people believe what they want to believe. Don't try to." Just let them go. Let it go, people. It's okay. If they want to think that the inefficient scores are great, you let them do that. Just let people live their lives. So,
well, on that note, thank you very much, Dave. It's been a fascinating, very interesting talk on the draft, NBA draft, and a good education for those of us not so familiar, and a really intriguing talk, lots of research. And just for your reference, I could see those results in that table, Dave, so that was visible.
good.
So, yeah. But thanks very much, Dave. Thanks everyone for your contributions. We are back again next week. Next week we have Stefan Szymanski presenting on the enduring love, the long-term effect of a new stadium on attendance for professional English soccer. So thanks everybody. Have a great weekend. See you all soon.
Thanks, everybody.